The ocean wind was always sharp in the evenings, even in June, but Allison Cooper had learned to stop noticing it. After nearly a month of living in her brother's coastal house while he traveled for work, she'd adjusted to the salty cold, the occasional whine of gulls, and the muted grumble of traffic drifting over the dunes. What she hadn't adjusted to, and what still made her jaw tighten, was the peculiar behavior of her new neighbors. Not rude exactly, not even unfriendly, just off. There were too many sideways glances and not enough direct words, too much visible coordination in silence. She wasn't the kind of person to chase after neighborhood gossip or care whether people waved from their mailboxes. Her patience was thick-skinned and cultivated through years of working with tight budgets, impossible construction schedules, and the kind of clients who thought deadlines were suggestions. But something about this place felt engineered, rehearsed, like every shrub was trimmed to communicate something unspoken. The house itself was fine. It wasn't hers, but she treated it like it was. Her brother, Jeremy, trusted her to keep things in order while he consulted overseas, and the arrangement had been mutually beneficial. The coastal property gave her space, quiet, and distance from a failed contract that had drained her spirit back home in Denver. A few months out of the noise seemed like the right idea. She'd brought her books, her plans, her habits. No drama, no noise, no clients, no politics. Which is why, when she came back from the market that Thursday evening and found a decorative table set up on her front porch, complete with a carafe of citrus water, a ring of metal folding chairs, and a stack of clipboards, her first reaction was not confusion but a quiet, hard disbelief. It was her porch, her space. The teakwood boards had been power-washed by her 3 days ago. The welcome mat was rolled slightly to one side, the way she left it. She hadn't let anyone in. She hadn't spoken to a soul in days. And yet, here it was. An entire setup, as though someone had decided her property had become their meeting hall. There was a laminated sign on the table. Typed in a pleasant serif font, it read, Community Circle, 6 p.m., light refreshments provided. Thank you for hosting. At the bottom, it was signed, Karen H., with a tiny sticker of a yellow sun next to her name. Allison stood there, groceries still in hand, staring at the sign, waiting for her brain to catch up with her eyes. She wasn't angry yet, not fully. It was more like a slow-building weight of tension collecting in her throat and spine. She set the bags down just inside the doorway, stepped back out, and took a full scan of the porch. No people, no cars parked aggressively close, no sign of who had done this or when. And yet, someone, or several someones, had entered her property without permission, arranged this scene with familiarity, and left without notice. It was bold. Not criminal, but entitled in a way that carried the stink of certainty, as if they believed nothing would be questioned. By 5:45 p.m., she had the table cleared, chairs folded and stacked, the sign removed and shredded. The carafe went directly into the garbage, untouched. She checked the porch cameras, but the footage was gone. Wiped clean. Either a glitch or something deliberate. She made a note to have Jeremy's tech guy look into it remotely. Still, she wasn't overly concerned. A minor boundary test. Strange and arrogant, yes, but maybe a miscommunication. Some other house meant to host, or some scheduling fluke, and they'd realize their mistake soon enough. At 6:02 p.m., the first knock came. Allison opened the door to a woman in her 60s with white blonde hair set into architectural curls. She wore a lavender cardigan over a floral blouse, had a wide, polished smile, and held a clipboard like it was part of her body. "Oh, you must be Allison. I'm Karen. Don't worry, we're just getting started. People usually trickle in." Allison didn't move. "Started what, exactly?" Karen laughed gently. "Our community circle. You got the letter, I assume? We've been rotating porch hosts since April. It's just casual. You don't need to do anything. No one told me I was hosting anything. Well, Jeremy used to let us use the porch when he was in town. It just kind of became a tradition. I assumed, since you're staying, it'd be fine. She gave a knowing smile. We all loved that view. Allison didn't return the smile. You assumed wrong. I'm not hosting a meeting. This is private property. I didn't agree to any tradition. Karen blinked once, the smile flickering but not dying. Oh, I see. It's just, this house has always been such a welcoming part of the community. I didn't think you'd be opposed. I am. There was a long silence. Karen's pleasant demeanor didn't crack, but something behind her eyes tightened. Then she nodded once and said, Of course. We'll relocate this time. But I do hope we can talk more later. I think we got off on the wrong foot. Allison didn't answer. She watched Karen retreat to her car, get in without looking back, and drive down the street at a steady, restrained pace. It wasn't the kind of confrontation Allison liked. She preferred things clear, direct, and clean. No passive tones, no coded guilt, no historical baggage attached to driveways. This was supposed to be simple. Stay in a house, keep it clean, water the plants, enjoy the view, leave. Instead, her first real contact with the neighborhood had ended with a social incursion and an unspoken warning delivered with lipstick and lemon water. Over the next few days, things returned to a tense kind of normal. No one else showed up. No more flyers, no more traditions. But Allison started to notice other things. Her garbage cans were moved a few feet to the right. Her mailbox was filled with neighborhood newsletters she never subscribed to. One morning, someone had placed a wind chime on the hook beside her front window. Not hers, not Jeremy's, something generic from a garden store. She removed it immediately, but the implication lingered. Someone was staking quiet, nonverbal claims. Someone was seeing her not as a resident, but as an obstacle to routine. Still, Allison said nothing. She documented the changes, took photos, logged dates. She didn't escalate, not yet. But she ordered a new external lock system for the porch, programmed it into the house's internal controls, and had the perimeter sensors reconfigured with a more aggressive motion profile. She was not naive. She'd worked in cities where buildings were stolen brick by brick through procedural neglect. She knew how people tested boundaries, not with grand gestures but with chairs and smiles and the assumption that silence equals consent. A week later, she came home from a morning walk to find the same table and chairs back on the porch. This time, there was no sign, just the setup, as if to say, "We're done asking." Allison didn't touch the table. She walked inside, checked the system panel, and waited. She didn't have to wait long. At 5:59 p.m., she watched through the window as Karen approached again, this time with two other women. They walked up the porch stairs like it belonged to them. No hesitation. Karen pulled out her clipboard again. The others started setting out napkins and pens. Allison tapped the control panel beside the front door. The soft, mechanical click of the auto lock sounded as every door on the porch sealed tight. The women didn't notice at first. Then Allison pressed a second button. From the exterior speakers hidden in the eaves, a blast of bagpipes filled the air. Not cheerful Highland tunes, but a looping, droning lament that built into a shrieking crescendo. Outside, the women jumped. One of them shouted something. Karen looked around in disbelief, then tried the door. It didn't budge. The music continued, piercing, surreal, unrelenting. Inside, Allison poured herself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply listened to the bagpipes scream across the porch, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, because some lines don't get redrawn quietly, and some traditions need to be broken by force. The day after the porch incident, Allison didn't leave the house. It wasn't out of fear or shame. Neither emotion had ever found a permanent home in her body, but rather out of something sharper, more alert, something like calculation. There were times when the most productive action was stillness, not to retreat, but to observe without disrupting the environment. She moved through the rooms like a tenant in someone else's story, noting what had changed, mentally cataloging which invisible hands had brushed against her boundaries. In her world, silence was never neutral. It was either a prelude or a weapon. She assumed correctly that the silence now blanketing the neighborhood wasn't a concession. It was strategy. That evening, just as the sky was dimming into its soft coastal grays, Allison heard a light, almost playful knock at the door. When she opened it, a white envelope had been slid onto the welcome mat. No name, no logo, just a tight piece of string tied into a neat knot around the center like a gift no one wanted to own. She picked it up, closed the door, and sat at the kitchen island to open it. Inside, typed on familiar stationery, was an official notice from the neighborhood council. No acronym, just a formal institutional header. It read as follows: "We acknowledge the unfortunate misunderstanding during this week's meeting. In light of the disruption, the council has rescheduled the remaining quarterly gatherings at 118 Moreland Terrace per historical precedent. Your participation is welcome but not required. Thank you for continuing to foster community." Allison didn't breathe for several seconds. The language was expertly chosen, conciliatory but passive-aggressive, dense with bureaucratic cushioning, as if nothing had truly happened. No mention of trespassing. No recognition that the property was privately owned by someone who had never consented to these uses. No apology, only quiet assertion. The phrase historical precedent clung to her brain like mildew, implying she was the one disrupting a legacy, not the other way around. It wasn't just audacity anymore. It was control wrapped in policy, disguised as politeness. It was how people were trained to rob you without leaving fingerprints. She folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it into the drawer where she kept utility bills. There would be no immediate response. If they were documenting her reactions, and she strongly suspected they would find none. That evening she cooked, took a long bath, read half a book she didn't enjoy, and slept with a penlight and notepad next to the bed. Her dreams were dry, fragmented visions of boardrooms and strangers who smiled without blinking. By the end of the week, the wind chime had returned. Not the same one. A different model, slightly larger, painted in a dull copper. It hung from the porch's central beam, not on the hook this time, but wired directly into the wood. There was no tag, no ribbon, no signature, just a sound. When the breeze shifted just right, it emitted a low, percussive rattle, almost metallic, like a clock winding itself over and over again. She didn't touch it. She simply got out her phone, took a photo, and sent it to Jeremy's legal contact with the subject line: "Persistent, unauthorized installation." That same afternoon, her motion sensors logged 2 disturbances, one at the side gate, one along the north fence. Both registered under the designated height threshold for wildlife, meaning someone had passed by, quickly, possibly crouched, and moved on. Not a break-in, not a threat, just another nudge, like fingers pressing gently on the outer edge of her self-control, waiting to see if she would flinch. She didn't flinch. She upgraded the cameras. The following Monday, a man in a city maintenance vest rang her bell. He was polite, young, clearly assigned to a task he didn't fully understand. He informed her that a request had been submitted for a public access pathway review, and that he needed to take measurements along the edge of her yard. When Allison asked who had submitted the request, he shrugged and said it came through the neighborhood development records, flagged under something called Legacy Access Use Case Number by the NARP. She asked him if this use case gave anyone the right to cross her lawn or gather on her porch. He looked genuinely confused. "Ma'am, I'm just here to measure the easement line." She let him do his job. He scanned the boundary, took notes, never stepped too far in. Before leaving, he offered her a copy of the form. She thanked him and held on to it like evidence. Later that night, she looked it up. Use Case 17B wasn't even an active designation in the county zoning code. It was either outdated or entirely fabricated. Either way, someone had leveraged a municipal system to legitimize a phantom claim. The next morning, a brochure arrived. Not a letter. A fully printed, glossy, 4-panel brochure with a color-coded map on the front and a mission statement on the back. It was slid under her door like a pizza menu. The map showed her property highlighted in green, labeled Community Shared Zone, with arrows pointing toward surrounding walkways. The statement, written in vague, overly warm language, referred to an initiative to return connection to historically inclusive spaces. The map was a lie. The label was offensive. The arrows made her stomach turn. There was no signature. Allison poured herself a glass of orange juice, sat at the kitchen table again, and considered the logic of escalation. She'd been patient. She had followed the path of proportional response, but what she was experiencing was not a misunderstanding. It wasn't even a conflict of values. It was a soft siege, an ideological occupation executed through mail, presence, and process. Whoever had created the brochure didn't care about her name or her rights. They cared about her inaction. They had mistaken her silence for surrender. She made 3 phone calls that day. 1 to the lawyer Jeremy had placed on retainer for property matters, 1 to the city zoning department, and 1 to a contractor who specialized in retrofitting security infrastructure into residential architecture without altering curb appeal. She didn't scream, didn't explain, didn't beg for help. She spoke with precision and documented everything. Her questions were brief. What are the legal parameters for public encroachment disputes? Can a municipal record be accessed by a private party without consent? What time can your team inspect the site? By the end of the day, she had answers. And by the end of the week, she had a plan. On Thursday afternoon, while outside trimming the hedges along the driveway, she noticed a woman, not Karen, pausing on the sidewalk pretending to admire the roses. She had a phone in her hand, not filming, just holding it, face angled slightly toward the porch. Allison caught her eye and nodded politely. The woman flushed and walked away. Later that night, Allison reviewed the footage. The woman had taken at least 5 photos of the porch before noticing she was being watched. Her timing was careful. She'd parked half a block away. Another orchestrated step in what was now undeniably a campaign. There was no graffiti, no breaking and entering. Just presence. Repeated, undeterred presence. At 2:11 a.m., the motion alert chimed again. This time, a figure briefly visible near the corner mailbox. Too far to identify, but close enough to trigger the sensor. Allison didn't go outside. She simply noted the timestamp, added it to the file, and adjusted the light timing to trigger sooner. By the end of that second week, she had amassed a quiet, undeniable record. Subtle manipulations of public systems, coordinated trespasses masked as social initiative, repeated attempts to redefine her property as communal, and a steadily growing list of individuals acting under vague authority. She was not being harassed. She was being absorbed, and that made all the difference. She began sleeping with the porch lights on, not out of fear, out of clarity, because predators of this kind didn't knock loudly or threaten openly. They wore smiles, they handed out cookies, they built consensus, and they always made sure someone else delivered the message. The first real breach didn't come in the form of noise or signage. It arrived quietly, almost elegantly, like a ritual dressed in civility. A Tuesday afternoon in early July, the air thick with pre-storm humidity, Allison returned from a short drive to find the table back on the porch. Not the same one from weeks ago, but a rounder, sturdier version, with a heavy ceramic vase set in the center filled with lavender. Around it were 6 identical chairs, all facing inward like petals on a flower. No note this time, no explanation, just the unmistakable intention of permanence. The visual language was precise. This is established. This belongs here, and if you object, you are the one disrupting harmony. She didn't touch the table. Not immediately. Instead, she stood motionless at the end of the path, keys still in hand, studying the arrangement. It was clean, deliberate, symmetrical, the product of forethought and practice. Whoever placed it had not rushed. There were no drag marks, no scuffs, no dropped tools or pieces of wrapping. It had been done with care, almost reverence, and that was what unsettled her the most. The reverence, as if her home were not being stolen, but sanctified. She entered through the garage, bypassing the porch entirely. Inside, she called the property lawyer, left a detailed voicemail, then filed a formal incident report through the city's residential property complaint system, attaching time-stamped photos. No dramatic confrontation, no door-slamming dramatics. Just the calm architecture of documentation, dates, evidence, context. When people want to control your space, you don't offer them your anger. You offer a paper trail they can't erase. That evening, she sat by the window as the rain started, watching droplets slide down the sides of the foreign furniture. The vase remained unmoved, the lavender still upright despite the storm. No one came to remove it. No one checked on it. Its presence was unacknowledged and unchallenged, as if it had been absorbed into the environment. Just another part of the porch now, no more remarkable than a doormat or a wind chime. But Allison didn't retreat. The following morning, just after sunrise, she wheeled the table and all 6 chairs down to the curb and taped a sign to them that read, "Unclaimed property. Remove immediately." By 10 a.m., they were gone. Not by sanitation, not by neighbors, but by someone in a gray SUV who pulled up, loaded the pieces in silent efficiency, and drove off without a glance toward the house. 2 days later, the retaliation came. It wasn't overt, not shattered glass, not graffiti, not even a complaint. It was more elegant than that. The sprinkler system, programmed carefully by Jeremy to alternate across zones, stopped working in half the yard. The box hadn't been tampered with. The settings were unchanged, but the lines feeding 2 of the back valves had been severed, cleanly, underground. A landscaping crew Allison didn't recognize happened to be trimming hedges 2 doors down. She approached them calmly, asked if they'd seen anything strange. They said no, but one of them, older than the rest, hesitated before answering and avoided eye contact. She didn't press. She simply thanked them and walked back inside. That night, she drafted a list, not of suspects, but of steps. Each item was a countermeasure, not a punishment. Reinforce, confirm, document, preempt. She contacted the irrigation company for a diagnostic check, arranged a system reset, and then installed micromonitors inside the fence's lower beams. Cameras the size of a thumbprint, set to alert her only when pressure or disturbance exceeded a programmed threshold. Not a fortress, just clarity, just certainty, just the elimination of ambiguity. By the weekend, a letter arrived, this time hand-delivered, folded neatly inside a small decorative envelope tucked into her screen door. It was handwritten in cursive, the kind of handwriting you only see on wedding invitations or condolence cards. The message was brief, but dense with implication. We understand your adjustments, and we respect your right to maintain personal order. Still, we regret the loss of mutual understanding. The shared spirit of our community cannot thrive when tradition is replaced with isolation. K. Allison read it 3 times. There was no threat, no direct accusation, just the quiet assertion that boundaries themselves were a kind of offense. She didn't reply, But that night she logged the letter in her growing digital archive, labeled the scan Passive 3, and added it to the chain of evidence she was quietly constructing. Then came the dog. It wasn't hers, and it wasn't stray. It was a golden retriever, clean, well-fed, wearing a collar with a charm shaped like a leaf. It appeared on her back lawn the next morning just after dawn, barking softly at the back sliding door. Allison opened the door halfway and waited. The dog didn't try to enter. It simply stared at her, then turned and started digging, enthusiastically, methodically, at the base of her rosemary bush. She called out. It ignored her. When she stepped outside and clapped loudly, the dog ran off, vanishing through a break in the rear hedges. The hole it left was a foot deep, and something metallic glinted at the bottom. She crouched and retrieved it. A flattened old sprinkler head, rusted and disconnected, not a part of her system. Possibly planted, possibly a coincidence. But by now, Allison no longer believed in coincidences. Later, she asked 2 neighboring houses if anyone was missing a retriever. No one claimed the dog. That evening, she reviewed the footage. The dog had entered the yard alone. No leash, no visible handler, but several minutes after, a figure had walked along the alley just out of range of the motion light, pausing by the hedge. The timing was exact. It was testing. Not aggression, not vandalism. A behavioral tap on the shoulder. The next escalation was human. Monday evening, just after dusk, Allison stepped outside to retrieve a package and found Karen standing at the edge of the porch, arms crossed, not smiling. "You've made your position clear," Karen said without preamble. "I just hope you understand the position you're putting others in." Allison didn't respond immediately. She took a long look at Karen, noting the stiff posture, the tightly held handbag, the slight sheen of sweat on her temples. It wasn't summer heat, it was confrontation heat, the temperature of control being questioned. "I'm not putting anyone anywhere," Allison said. "I'm enforcing private property boundaries, which I shouldn't have to explain." Karen shifted her weight slightly, her gaze narrowing. "There's always been flexibility here, a sense of shared space. You're not just rejecting people. You're redefining how this street functions. That has consequences." Allison stepped forward, closing the gap by 2 feet, not enough to threaten, but enough to end the illusion of casual conversation. "You should be more careful with that word," she said. "Consequences. It makes you sound like you think you're in charge." Karen inhaled slowly, held it, then smiled. The old smile again, the thin one, strained at the corners. "I just wanted to talk," she said softly. "Some people respond better face to face. Some people should stop responding entirely." Karen gave a small nod, turned, and walked back to her car. The next day, Allison received an official citation notice, mailed this time, stamped with a seal, alleging that her porch lighting created visual obstruction hazards during dusk hours and recommending immediate compliance review. The game had changed. They were moving to paperwork now. Bureaucracy as a blade. And Allison, calm, practiced, prepared, smiled for the first time in weeks. Not out of amusement, but because this was finally a language she spoke fluently. The morning the compliance officer showed up, Allison had already been awake for hours. She'd taken to rising early before the neighborhood noise began, not out of paranoia, but for preparation. Her rituals had become methodical, deliberate. The perimeter was checked, systems recalibrated, notes logged. The previous week had passed with an uneasy quiet, the kind that doesn't soothe but simmers, full of a held breath. No chairs, no flyers, no Karen. Just stillness, as though the entire block were paused in anticipation of the next play. So, when a silver sedan with a city department decal parked across from her driveway, she wasn't surprised. She watched from the living room window as a man in a navy windbreaker stepped out, clipboard in hand, and began slowly walking along the sidewalk, examining her front lights. He didn't knock at first, just took notes, glanced at angles. Held a small laser measuring tool up toward the porch. She let him finish. When he finally approached the door, she opened it before he could press the bell. "Good morning," she said without warmth. He seemed startled by the door opening on its own. Yes, morning. Allison Cooper?" She nodded once. "I'm with the Municipal Safety Inspection Office. We received a complaint related to non-compliant outdoor lighting affecting visual clarity for drivers and pedestrians during the low light conditions. I'm here to perform a routine check." "Do you have a copy of the complaint?" "Not directly. It was submitted through the Residential Compliance Portal, anonymous, as per policy." "Of course," Allison said. "Please go ahead. I'll observe from inside." He seemed relieved not to be challenged. He resumed his measurements, occasionally scribbling in a small form. Allison watched silently through the front window. There was no aggression in the man's behavior, no bias. He was simply another cog, another tool wielded by a hand that remained unseen. 10 minutes later, he knocked again and offered her a printed notice. Preliminary findings indicated no actionable violations. However, it noted a recommendation to reduce brightness by 10% to maintain goodwill within the community. A phrase she found fascinating in its careful dishonesty. Enforcement disguised as diplomacy. She thanked him politely and closed the door. Then she scanned the document and filed it alongside the others. The folder was thickening. She had photos, letters, timestamps, municipal references, legal responses, and now an official notice, however toothless. This was no longer a collection of random encounters. It was an attempt, coordinated, distributed, precise, to normalize the idea that her ownership was negotiable. Later that week, she received a visit from someone she hadn't expected. Not from the neighborhood, but from the office of the attorney who managed Jeremy's regional holdings. A woman named Denise Rourke, early 40s, sharp-featured with a voice that never strayed into idle tone, arrived unannounced but requested only 15 minutes. Allison let her in. They sat in the kitchen. Denise carried a leather folio and a neutral expression. She didn't waste time. "I've been reviewing the neighborhood activity reports Jeremy flagged for follow-up," she began. "We've handled similar cases, though rarely this persistent. It seems you've been the target of an informal campaign designed to recharacterize your property for partial communal use, a type of informal easement, dressed as tradition." Allison nodded. "That's what I thought. But they're careful. No open threats, no trespass charges stick. Everything's framed as suggestion." Denise opened the folio and slid a document across the counter. "They've also filed a petition with the Neighborhood Management Commission to declare the front-facing portion of your property a historic civic meeting site. It's symbolic, but dangerous. If approved, it doesn't force you to give up space, but it gives the council legal grounds to interfere with certain modifications you might want to make. Fencing, for instance. Landscaping. Exterior access changes. All under the pretense of preservation." Allison stared at the document. "And my brother knew this was coming?" He suspected. The same group tried something similar in Redwood Park. Smaller scale, but the tactics were identical. Community memory is hard to fight in court. People will testify they remember meetings here, even if those meetings never happened, or happened once, 30 years ago, in passing. "Memory as precedent," Allison muttered. "They weaponize nostalgia." Denise closed the folder. "We'll challenge it, but you need to know. They'll escalate. Not with force, but with process, with tone, with implication. You won't be threatened. You'll be portrayed." Allison understood. In such battles, public image often outweighed fact. She wasn't being accused of wrongdoing. She was being positioned as inhospitable, cold, An outsider who failed to participate. Someone who didn't wave, didn't host, didn't contribute. And that was enough. Not for prosecution, but for pressure. That night, Allison sat on the back porch, away from the now infamous front veranda. The ocean wind rolled in slowly, brushing the dry grasses beyond the hedge line. She didn't play music, didn't speak, just listened, to nothing, to everything. Her strength had never come from outbursts, it came from decisions, from the ability to see an angle before it became a wall. She wasn't going to hold a protest. She wasn't going to call a town meeting. She was going to erase ambiguity. The next morning, she installed a brushed metal sign at the base of the porch steps. It was clean, unobtrusive, mounted on a dark walnut stake that blended with the house's aesthetic. No neon colors, no aggression, just text engraved in calm, capitalized serif. This is private property, access by permission only. This is not a community space. Below that, in smaller font, trespassing will be documented. Recorded footage is stored off-site. She didn't need it to scare anyone. She needed it to kill the illusion that silence meant permission. She watched from the living room window as two people walking their dogs stopped, read the sign, and moved on without comment. No protests, no scoffing, just a reset. A narrative realigned. The Bagpipes returned that night. Not loud, not weaponized, just low, distant, looping softly through the house's built-in speakers. Not because anyone was there to hear it, but because she was. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't a stunt. It was a reminder of tone, of presence, of territory. Because sometimes the only way to hold the line is to make sure they know it never moved. The silence that followed the installation of the sign was not peace. It was the kind of silence that hangs between courtroom sentences, or over hospital beds in the final moments before a monitor flatlines. Anticipatory, dry, and brittle. The neighbors adjusted quickly. Some stopped making eye contact when they passed her driveway. Others nodded with awkward hesitance, no longer certain if friendliness would be misinterpreted as affiliation. Karen was nowhere to be seen. No chairs, no flyers, no subtle gifts of lavender on the porch. For the first time in weeks, Allison could walk from her garage to her front door without feeling like she was stepping into someone else's constructed idea of her role in the neighborhood. The sign had worked, not by command, but by reasserting something deeply unfashionable, a boundary. But even boundaries, when clearly marked, can provoke resentment. There are people who do not hate walls, but who hate the implication that they are not trusted to cross them. For such people, the idea of private space is not offensive because it excludes. It is offensive because it reminds them they are not in control of where they may go, and when, and how. The first sign of retaliation came in the form of a letter, not from Karen, nor from any counsel. This one arrived via certified mail, in a thick envelope bearing the official seal of the county's Department of Land Use and Zoning. Inside was a multi-page notice informing her of a pending review regarding non-conforming modifications to the structure of her property. It listed vague concerns. Alterations made without proper historic review, potential obstruction of access points, and potentially unauthorized use of surveillance equipment inconsistent with local guidelines for shared residential zones. The language was tentative, careful, and utterly maddening in its bureaucratic noncommittal. Allison read it 3 times, then forwarded it to Denise Rourke. The reply came fast, blunt, and alarmingly calm. They're trying to reclassify the porch as a shared feature under an old civic overlay program. It was shut down years ago, but someone's revived it. Selectively, quietly, and just for your lot. We'll fight it, but be prepared. This won't stop at paper. It didn't. That weekend, 2 men in plain khakis and city ID tags arrived unannounced and began walking her property's edge with measuring wheels and clipboards. When she stepped outside to ask the nature of their work, they handed her a folded notice explaining that her lot had been selected for a spatial verification audit in light of recent historical usage claims. Neither man answered any follow-up questions. They didn't smile. They didn't threaten. They measured, noted, and left, taking her landscape's dimensions like they were stripping it of privacy 1 inch at a time. The next day, a tree along her west fence line, one of the oldest and most beautiful on the property, was found split. Not cut, not fallen from storm or rot, but deliberately severed at the base, as if someone had used a thick blade or chainsaw at a downward angle, rendering it unstable. It hadn't toppled yet. It leaned now, dangerously close to the neighboring property line. She contacted a certified arborist who confirmed the damage was intentional. When she asked for a written statement, he hesitated. "I can write what I observed," he said carefully, "but I can't tell you who did it." "You don't have to," she replied. "Just tell the truth." That night, as the wind picked up, Allison stayed awake watching the tree sway. If it fell during the night, there would be no question whose fault it would appear to be. At 2:30 a.m., she got up, dressed in silence, and went outside. She ran 2 lines of industrial-strength cord between the tree's base and an anchor in the ground and reinforced the weight with sandbags she'd saved from an old construction project. It wasn't elegant, but it was stable. She slept for 4 hours, then scheduled a removal crew. 3 days later, someone painted the curb in front of her house red. Not city workers. The shade was off, the stroke lines uneven, and there had been no advance notice. But the job was convincing enough that 2 delivery drivers passed her home entirely, rerouting her scheduled service drop-off to a distribution center 5 miles away. When she called the city office to report the unauthorized paint job, the woman on the phone apologized profusely and said a similar incident had occurred on another street last year, over a parking dispute. That same afternoon, she installed a second security camera, this one angled at the curb. Denise filed an injunction to halt any zoning reclassification of the porch, but legal procedures moved slowly. While courts debated historical overlays and property edges, the people behind this campaign began attacking something less tangible. Allison's image. Flyers began to appear, not on her door, not even on the immediate block, but several streets away. Printed on plain white paper with no identifying logos, the flyers bore phrases like, "What happened to community?" and "Why fight against shared space?" One included a blurry photo of her front porch with the sign clearly visible. The caption read, "Is this what we want our neighborhood to become?" Neighbors began whispering. Not openly. The kind of conversation that gets passed through second glances, awkward pauses, sudden interest in a hedge or a bird when Allison approached. One woman, who had always been polite, now crossed the street when Allison was walking her recycling to the curb. Children no longer cut through the edge of her yard on bikes. The narrative was shifting, not toward violence, but toward alienation, toward the kind of social erasure that allows people to believe you were always the problem, even before they knew your name. That week, Allison stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night. She started keeping a physical logbook in addition to the digital archive. Times, names, weather, any pattern, no matter how minor. She reviewed local code every night, memorizing the language they might try to weaponize against her. She didn't rant online. She didn't confront neighbors. She simply watched, waited, and adapted. But even her patience had limits. One Thursday morning, a knock came at 7:12 a.m. A man stood outside in a dark blue suit, not smiling, not apologizing. He introduced himself as a representative from the Residential Architectural Review Committee, a group she hadn't known existed. We're conducting a review of external modifications on properties near the coastline to ensure visual cohesion with historical aesthetic standards. Allison stared at him. You're here about my porch? We've had some concerns expressed, he said neutrally. In particular, the recent signage. That sign isn't a modification. It's a notice. He didn't flinch. All notices are subject to review under the same guidelines as aesthetic alterations. If it's visible from the street, it qualifies. She exhaled slowly. Is this a warning? No, ma'am. This is an invitation to comply voluntarily. She closed the door without another word. That evening, she didn't sleep at all. She sat at the kitchen table until dawn, going over every document she had, every complaint, every notice, every surveillance timestamp and photograph. The goal was no longer just to resist. The goal was to document everything in such suffocating detail that no narrative could overwrite the reality she was living. On the 7th day of that week, a neighbor's dog defecated on her porch. Not on the grass, not on the sidewalk, directly in front of the sign. The message could not have been clearer. That night, Allison reprogrammed the porch lock system and adjusted the speaker configuration. She wasn't going to retaliate. She was going to clarify. And she was going to do it in the only language the neighborhood had forced her to adopt. Demonstration. The last time Karen walked up the steps to Allison's porch, it wasn't with a clipboard or lemon water or the performative smile she so often wore like armor. This time, there was no audience, no entourage, no gestures of community. She arrived alone, unannounced in broad daylight, wearing the same pale blue blouse Allison had seen her wear the day she'd first tried to convert the porch into a neighborhood amphitheater. But the blouse didn't fit her the same anymore. It hung a little looser at the shoulders as though even fabric was now unsure of its allegiance. Her eyes scanned the porch before she stepped forward, just far enough for the auto-lock system to register her presence with a quiet, mechanical click, sealing the door behind Allison from the inside. Allison didn't bother pretending she hadn't seen her coming. She'd been watching from the window since Karen parked her car across the street. There was no question what this was. Not a surrender, not an olive branch. This was ritual. Final performance. The last round in a war that had long since abandoned the illusion of subtlety. You've made this very difficult, Karen said, her voice quieter than expected, a practiced softness that couldn't conceal the tension around her mouth. People are talking. Some are angry. Some are afraid, frankly. Allison didn't blink. Afraid of what? My porch? My boundaries? They're afraid of change, of losing things that made this place feel safe, feel shared. Shared is not the same as stolen. Karen's nostrils flared, but her composure remained intact. This neighborhood was built on tradition. That porch has been a gathering place since before either of us lived here. Allison stepped forward, not aggressively, just enough to let the house censors know she was still in control. My brother's deed doesn't list tradition as a clause. Neither does mine. And if your nostalgia needs to occupy someone else's space to survive, then maybe it never belonged in the first place. Karen looked like she wanted to respond, but the words tangled somewhere between memory and entitlement. Instead, she turned her head slightly as if listening for something behind her, maybe support that wasn't coming, or an argument she'd rehearsed but could no longer justify. Allison didn't move. She simply tilted her head toward the nearest mounted speaker, pressed a button on the remote in her pocket, and waited. The sound that followed wasn't loud, not at first. Just the slow, mournful drone of bagpipes bleeding into the still afternoon air, a sound that didn't attack so much as declare. It filled the space between them like fog, displacing whatever performative energy Karen had brought with her. Her shoulders tightened. I've asked for meetings, Karen said over the sound. I've filed notices. I've tried to create dialogue. You've tried to outlast my silence, Allison replied. You failed. Karen took a step back, her foot hitting the first stair without looking. The speakers swelled slightly, not to deafen, but to make presence undeniable. This was no longer defense. It was warning. "I could bring this back to the council," Karen said louder now. "There are people who still believe this house belongs to everyone." "But it doesn't," Allison said calmly. "And belief is not law." For a brief moment, Karen stood frozen, eyes locked on the sign that still hung beside the porch light, the one that had become the neighborhood's quiet symbol of rebellion. Her lips moved slightly, maybe to form a word she couldn't commit to. Then, with a final glance that held no victory, no defeat, only exhaustion, she turned and descended the stairs. Allison didn't watch her go. Inside, the lock disengaged automatically. The music faded, replaced by silence so complete it rang louder than the pipes. She exhaled slowly and walked into the kitchen, where the tablet on the counter had already logged the interaction. Time, date, voice capture, motion, data. Not because she planned to use it, but because it mattered. Because in a world that twisted narrative into weaponry, data was the last thing that couldn't be argued. That night, the neighborhood went quiet. No flyers, no emails, no mysterious dogs or painted curbs, just silence. Pure, uninterrupted, waiting silence. 3 days passed before she received a letter, this one official, but not hostile. It came from the county registrar's office confirming that the petition to designate her porch as a shared civic site had been withdrawn. No explanation, no apology, just withdrawal. Clean and final. Another letter came later that week from the City Compliance Board, closing the investigation into her lighting, her signage, and the so-called historical aesthetic violations. The file was marked inactive. No further action required. The final piece arrived hand-delivered, but not by Karen. A man in a brown coat with a leather satchel knocked gently, handed Allison a sealed envelope, and walked away without a word. Inside was a single-page typed note with no letterhead, no name, no official seal. Just a sentence. "We will not be organizing any further gatherings at your residence. Consider this matter concluded." Allison read it twice, folded it, and slid it into the file next to every other attempt, every other threat, every ghost of resistance that had tried to claim her silence. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She turned off the porch lights that night, poured herself a glass of wine, and sat at the window, watching the wind stir the bushes along the curb. The victory was not loud. It didn't come with a round of applause or some grand vindication. It came in stillness. The absence of trespass, the restoration of control. Later, as the house settled around her, she reprogrammed the speaker system. The bagpipes weren't deleted. They weren't retired. They were moved to a special setting, labeled simply Karen Mode. Because even now, the memory lingered. Not of the fight, but of the moment someone tried to turn her space into a symbol, and lost. The weeks that followed passed without interruption. No more clipped notes tucked under her door, no ambiguous city visits, no rearranged porch furniture in the night. The mailbox returned to delivering only what was meant for her. The trash bins remained precisely where she left them. And the wind chime, the last unwanted artifact of other people's intentions, had long since been removed, leaving behind only a faint stain on the beam where it had once hung. For the first time since arriving, Allison could walk barefoot across the porch boards without the tension of anticipation pulling tight across her shoulders. Her mornings returned to what they should have been from the beginning. Quiet rituals, coffee at sunrise, a slow breath in a house that no longer felt like a battleground. There were changes, of course, but not the kind that drew attention. The sign by the steps remained in place, not as a warning anymore, but as punctuation. A closing line in a conversation that had ended. The garden received more attention, not out of performance, but presence. She replaced one section of hedge with low stone edging, not as a barrier, but as a frame. Her boundaries were no longer statements. They were choices. Understood, accepted, no longer debated. The neighbors didn't avoid her anymore, but they didn't approach either. They walked their dogs, waved from across the street, nodded if they passed her at the mailbox, but the undercurrent of surveillance had disappeared. It had become easier, somehow, to leave her alone. Easier than re-entering a narrative that no longer needed their participation. People moved on quickly when nothing more could be extracted. Karen was still around. Allison saw her once or twice from a distance, always in motion, always surrounded by the quieter, newer members of the neighborhood. Her authority hadn't vanished, but it had thinned. The Porch incident had become a whisper in community circles, something half-remembered but not retold. Whatever version of the story was now passed around, Allison didn't care. There was no need to correct it. Her reputation didn't need rebuilding. It had simply hardened, like concrete curing under pressure. It wasn't likability she'd won. It was permanence. Jeremy called from Lisbon 2 weeks after the final letter arrived, and she told him everything. Not in a rushed summary or with dramatic flair, but slowly, methodically, like a structure being explained brick by brick. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, there was a long pause on the other end. "I should have warned you," he finally said. "I thought maybe it had calmed down since last time." Allison didn't respond right away. She looked out the window, at the sky darkening over the hedge line. It didn't need a warning. It needed a response. And now it has one. He laughed quietly, not unkindly. "Did you really use bagpipes?" She smiled, but only faintly. Only when it was absolutely necessary. They didn't talk long after that. There wasn't much left to say. The property had been secured, the process recorded, the interference neutralized. What had started as an unwanted intrusion had evolved into a slow war of identity, and she had endured it not by being louder, but by being immovable. The night she finally turned off the Porch system for the first time in months, she did so without ceremony. No drinks, no dramatic gestures. Just a quiet tap on the touchscreen, a disengagement of alerts, a signal that she no longer needed to be on guard. Not because the neighborhood had changed, but because she no longer feared its attempts to change her. She sat on the steps that evening, barefoot, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, the sea breeze brushing softly against her arms. The porch lights were off. The house was dark behind her. A single sensor light from across the street flickered, catching the silhouette of someone walking a dog. They passed without turning their head, and in that stillness with nothing left to fight or defend, she let the silence settle. Not as a threat, not as a warning, but as something finally earned. Not victory, but ownership.